Hello everyone, welcome back to the ALCON Podcast. After a long hiatus, we've rebooted the show due to popular demand, and to kick things off, we're privileged to have Sam Guthrie, an author whose career spanned over 2 decades in international relations before writing The Peak, a thriller set against the backdrop of China's rise in the Indo-Pacific. As someone who comes from the intelligence community, I could not put this down. It's got everything from geopolitics, political intrigue, espionage, humor, coercion, and it's just ticked all the boxes. So Sam, welcome to the ALCON Podcast.
Thanks so much, Cole. Thanks for having me. And it means a great deal with someone of your background to have been interested enough to keep on turning the pages and then have a conversation. So thank you.
No worries. So just to kick things off, Sam, if you don't mind, just introduce yourself, talk a bit about your background and what led you to write The Peak.
Sure. Look, I've had a 25-year career in international relations. That included working as a trade envoy, predominantly around China and Southeast Asia. I was in the Hong Kong consulate as Deputy Consul General for Australia during the period up to and including the 2019 protests that we saw in Hong Kong. Then back in Australia, working as a senior government official in Canberra, working across a number of things that interacted with, for example, the AUKUS program here about nuclear submarines in Australia, a number of things around foreign investment, and sort of the consistent theme in that interplay between investment and trade and business, with that overlay of, well, how do we also manage about foreign interference in the country? How do you do trade and investment without exposing business people to coercion, et cetera, et cetera? So a lot of my time, both in government and outside government, has been around that really interesting interplay. And I guess that's where some of the inspiration came from. I like many, I guess, who work in an international space, you sort of see stuff and you're involved in things that it pushes some inspiration buttons, and you think, oh, at some point I'll write about that. And for me, I finished up my government role, and I thought, well, I've got some free time now. I might as well put pen to paper and have a crack. And so, yeah, what was born was this novel, The Peak, which I'm happy to tell you a bit more about if you like.
Yeah. I guess just you go straight into The Peak. Let everyone know high level what it's about without containing too many spoilers. I know a few people that are reading it at the moment.
Okay. Well, it's one of those books that's hard to talk about without giving away spoilers, but I'll do my best. It's it sort of centers around something that happens during the 1997 handover of Hong Kong from British sovereignty to the UK. It's about 2 young Australian men, best friends from school, grew up together. They leave school and they go over for the handover. Now, they want to be there at this massive turning point in history, the last sort of glimmer of the British Empire, on screen, on television screens across the world as Chris Patton and King Charles, sails out through the Hong Kong harbour. So they go over there to be there for that moment. And they both fall in love with the same young Chinese woman called Chloe. And, as these things often play out, their sort of love for her turns into a bit of a test of the loyalty of their friendship. And then it results in a betrayal and a compromise, which haunts all 3 of them for the rest of their lives. But the book itself begins about 30 years after that. There's 2 boys, one, Sebastian, he's now an assistant minister for foreign affairs in Canberra, in Parliament in Canberra, which is Australia's capital. And his best friend was also there, Charlie. He's now his chief of staff. And they receive a note one morning from Chloe's father. It's a note in Mandarin, just 3 words. And when he receives it, standing in his parliamentary office, Sebastian does something that's so horrific, so shocking. I won't say what it is and spoil it, but it's horrific and shocking, and it means that for the rest of the book, which is set across 24 hours, his best mate Charlie needs to work out why the hell did his best friend do such a horrible thing? How is it linked to what happened back then in 1997 during the handover in Hong Kong? And how ultimately does it suggest that potentially they're witnessing the end of the world as they know it?
Great synopsis of the book without giving too much away, because that event in the novel, once I got to that part in the book, I was like, wow, okay, this has gone from 0 to 100 real quick.
Yeah. The ambition was to punch you in between the eyes, by the end of the first chapter, and hopefully it landed.
Yeah, no, it was really good. Hey, something I really, really enjoyed about The Peak itself, it wasn't so much the plot of the story. I think that was great. That's cool. But it was the characters, and I think they had a lot of depth. So a person like Charlie, loyal to a fault, very loyal to Sebastian, his best friend. But at the same time, I kind of grew somewhat frustrated with him being a little bit too loyal. For everything Sebastian did or didn't do to Charlie, he'd always go back to him. And then same thing with Sebastian, right? He's like the model diplomat, speaks multiple languages. He's, a massive presence in any room, all that kind of good stuff. But at the same time, he's a very flawed human. So I'm just wondering, were the characters shaped on your own career and the people you know, or even yourself?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people say about the book, oh, I love the book, but your characters are pretty horrible. And then my response is, but they're based on me and my friends. So,
Right.
careful what you say. But no, I think that I think they're all very interesting, but they are all sort of testing their likability a bit. I was really interested in that theme of loyalty. I think that we see it a lot in my country, in your country, particularly in the US and elsewhere, this idea of loyalty, staying loyal to what you believe in. Loyalty is an admirable value up to a point, beyond which then it sort of becomes doctrine. It sort of becomes, a form of madness, and you can be loyal to politics, as other characters are in the book. The father of the Chinese woman, Chloe, Zhang, he's loyal to a fault to Beijing and to the history of the rise of China. So you can be loyal to politics, you can be loyal to friendship, you can be loyal to your own self-promotion, and you can be loyal to love. But if it goes past a certain point, then really you're loyal to madness, and that has a real, bad impact on the world. So I was really interested in testing that theme out. But again, like the geopolitical theme, there's a lot of geopolitics, a lot of drawing on my background and sort of, understanding and being close up to the rise of China and the Asia Pacific and all of that. I wanted to get into those themes. But if it was just a book about that, it'd probably be a bit boring. And so to your point, I wanted to put characters up the front, characters that are three-dimensional, characters that are flawed. You like them, you want them to do other things. Sometimes you're disappointed in them. And to get those characters, I drew on me and I drew on some of my friends. And the arc of this book is about these two close friends that went to a really kind of privileged private school in Australia, and their friendship was forged in that kind of anvil of having the crap beaten out of them at school and being bullied and all of that. But in that forge, you make the really close friendships that last you an entire life. And, when I was in Hong Kong, I have this distinct memory of a very close mate of mine from school was with me, and we had a great time in Hong Kong. He was in business, I was at the consulate. We'd go to this China Club, which was in the old Bank of China in Hong Kong. You probably know it, Colin. It's really exclusive, lovely club, and you can sit on the balcony up the top and you look out across Hong Kong. And we'd had all these lovely nights out there together and with friends and doing business and whatnot. But this one particular night we were up there, and rather than watching the beautiful skyline, we were watching helicopters buzzing the streets and clouds of tear gas sort of floating across, and the sounds of police sirens and protests. And we sort of turned to each other and thought, how have we ended up here, this close to this point in history, to boys that came from this high school all the way through? So that was a bit of the inspiration too. The twists and turns of friendship that are impacted not only by your own relationship, but also by the twists of time and the things that you've experienced together.
Yeah, and your point about if you just focused on the plot itself, it could turn into quite a boring kind of book. As someone, and I thought about this today before I jumped on the call with you. I was like, okay, he's writing about China and the rise of China and all that kind of thing. And I've read so much about that, both in my professional life and just day to day. Reading an intelligence assessment, okay, you hear about the assessment, you hear about what's going on. It's quite dry, right? But to wrap that up in such a compelling novel and compelling plot with some great characters, I thought it was a really engaging way to tackle those kind of big issues as well, especially the issues that aren't really talked about and not talked about enough.
Yeah, well, you've nailed it. That was entirely my sort of motivation in doing this. One, I wanted to write a book that was interesting that people would hopefully buy. Yeah. But the other side of it was, I've spent so much of the last years, like you, focused on this stuff from a professional perspective, and having those meetings in Canberra or elsewhere in locked rooms where you leave your phone outside and you talk about it amongst yourselves. And that is reassuring to know that grown-ups somewhere are talking about these issues and tracking, national resilience and economic security and having these sort of conversations. But what really worries me is that the rest of the country isn't, that it's not a point of discussion that we see quite regularly in our newspapers. There's one I often talk about. A couple of years ago in Australia, there was a series of articles called Red Alert that were published in a number of national papers. Basically, it was a series of stories about the scenarios around what would happen if China invaded Taiwan. And they went into detail about, what would Australia do, what would China do, what would the US do? And, interesting scenarios, maybe a bit overblown, but interesting. What I was fascinated by was the reaction like people in business, people in politics, people in the commentariat said, you can't be writing about this stuff. This should be, something that we talk about in the Capitol behind closed doors. We can't be talking about it. But my view is always that if we want the population to be informed and vote on things like defense spending, like, do we need to take more proactive action, preventative action, whatever it is, you want them to be informed, which means educating them. And so that's the core principle. But at the same time, to your point, not everyone wants to read a big briefing book on geopolitics. Not everyone wants to sort of hear me crap on with the treatises about loyalty. So if you can encapsulate that in a book that's fast paced, that's a thriller that turns the pages, that has great characters, that has, music from the 90s and is accessible, then that hopefully achieves the two things at once. And so that was the ambition. You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah. A lot of similar books that I've read, we read Tom Clancy and a lot of other authors, they're set in like the Cold War or attacking Russia, Russia attacks the West, all that kind of thing. I think the last book I read, it was a book called War with Russia, and it kind of made a prediction on the Ukraine war and things like that, sort of playing out. So this is actually the first book that I've read set in our backyard, right, in the Indo-Pacific with the rise of China. So it's really, really refreshing.
And this blows me away too. I agree with you. Like there's so many the great books, right, about the Cold War, about war with Russia, about a lot of books written on the Middle East and terrorism, all in this genre. The biggest geopolitical challenge of the 21st century is going to go down in the Asia Pacific, and it'll be between China and it'll be between the US and New Zealand and Australia. We're right in the middle of that. And so why isn't there more being written about this? And particularly in our countries, why isn't there more? But there's not that much being written about it. So people have, that's sort of been the reaction to the peak. It's like, oh, well, why hasn't anyone done this before? I'm not sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And were there any events that, in what ways did your work in diplomacy shape the events of the peak? Were there like any moments where you thought, if I didn't write this down, nobody would believe it kind of thing, or anything like that?
Look, I mean, being close to the Hong Kong protests was one of them. That doesn't play an overly significant role within the book. It's more of a background. I was obviously there at the time. I was struck. I remember walking on the first day that tear gas was used against those protesters. I remember sort of having been near them as I went walking to the office or something, and being struck by the faces of the protesters walking down to Legco and just how young they were. Like the young youth, possibly naivete of those kids going into protest was something they believed in, but was, ultimately their parents all were really terrified that if you go and do this and you make this trouble, then you're going to pull down the roof of the freedoms that we actually experience in Hong Kong. One country, two systems will disappear. And that's, very much what happened as the national security law came into play. So sort of capturing some of that naivete was important to me, and I sort of drew some of that out in my character of Chloe, this young Chinese woman that's in Hong Kong, and it's sort of a struggle around her. She's pulled one way by this Western boy, Sebastian, who ultimately goes on to be a foreign affairs minister in Australia. He's sort of trying to draw her into thinking about things through the Western lens. And then her father, who works for a state-owned enterprise, very Chinese, very Beijing-centric, is trying to draw her back towards, the believing in her culture and her people. And so that, I think, is very much informed by me spending a long time in China and watching the rise of China in the 21st century. It's the first time that a country that was, ground down for, as they call it, a century of humiliation, is now returning to its place on the world stage as a global superpower. We've never seen that before. And seeing that up close, seeing the change in attitude of the government, particularly after President Xi came into power, has all been very, very fascinating. And so I wanted to capture that, but also, again, coming down onto the character level, I've taken a lot of delegations to China over the years. And, you take business delegations in there, and all these business people, they're different to diplomats or people from your sort of services. They don't know what to expect. We have training, we're told what to expect, how to mitigate risks. These people are a little bit wet behind their ears. They're going and they're excited, and what happens on tour stays on tour. And so then I'll get a call late at night by someone who they'll say, oh, look, I've brought someone back to my hotel room and now they won't leave. Or the person at the breakfast table in the morning says, I saw there's a video camera behind my bathroom mirror, and it's been blinking every time I walk in. Or there's the stories of the ministers who will take a whole bunch of surprise money, political donations from property developers, and then show up on Chinese language television in Australia talking about, oh, actually the claimants to the South China Sea have got it wrong and it all belongs to China. So that really seeing over the years people sort of being dragged along in the drift of that rise of China, and maybe through the pull of money, of power, of sex, of whatever it is, become compromised in that mix, and then watching them under pressure, that was sort of an inspiration to me. So like the book isn't about fast car chases and exploding pens and people abseiling down the building. It's what happens to normal people when they're under the pump of being compromised in those sort of situations.
That's exactly, I think, what drew me to the Peak, and what I loved the most about it is because you explored those kind of ideas and that sort of coercion as well, especially without revealing too much, but with Sebastian, right? And his massive vulnerability that is essentially taken advantage of through the MSS. And when you talk about the MSS and their fronts and all of that kind of stuff, I'd get goosebumps reading about it, because I was like, this guy has done his research, or he's got experience in that kind of realm. So it's like 2 thumbs up.
Thank you. And I mean, I've been close to it, but I got to call out, there's an Australian writer called Alex Joske, and he wrote a book called Spies and Lies, which I plug in the back of the Peak. He's one of the foremost, actually, I just so happen to have a copy of it here, one of the foremost writers in Australia about the MSS and about its capacity for influence. And so fascinating, because tracking that whole grand narrative that was out there in the sort of the early part of 2000s through until about 2016, this idea that, the more that we engage with China and draw them into the international system, then they'll become just like us. And that there was a motivation for Chinese who didn't believe in that. Again, maybe after 100 years of, as they say, humiliation, why should anyone have thought that they would just be a benign power and rise in a benign way? They went along with this narrative, and it suited the interests of business people who had great trade deals. It suited the interests of young students who went over and learned Chinese, Mandarin, and then came back to their countries and, had a position of influence in peak bodies and local media. It drew out on all of those different motivations. But then when slowly dripping into some of those opportunities comes, well, could you provide us an essay about the political situation in Australia? Could you potentially, come over and give us a debriefing on certain things? And we see it take a slightly darker turn. To me, that arc that's occurred with greater prominence over the last sort of 10 years in particular is really fascinating, and something that we all should be aware of, particularly not just people like you and me, but people doing business in those sort of regions.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think a lot of the audience that I have, they certainly don't have the diplomatic background and anything like that. Largely enthusiasts or maybe intelligence backgrounds. So I need to ask, what is it like doing business with China versus doing business in the West, but just based on your own experience?
Yeah, look, I think, I'll talk about the West as it is traditionally, as opposed to maybe how it's shifting a little bit with various administrations and changes and other things in the US. I think doing business in the West is often, in a positive way, it is doing it with a degree of predictability, with very clear governance, guardrails, laws, and above board and transparency. And, a negative view on that is where it takes time and it's very slow and it's a bit cumbersome and sometimes governance, doesn't keep up with the pace that you need to land your commercial transaction. In a place like China, China has done this amazing thing over the last 20, 25 years, which is drag, a billion people out of poverty, hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty. By doing so at such a pace, has begotten a whole bunch of opportunities to engage with overseas investment coming into the country, or to, do wonderful deals, which meant that things can be sourced out of China very, very quickly. So my point is, there's been plenty of opportunity to do things faster and maybe without the same level of rigor, the same level of transparency, the same sort of laws around things like bribery and anti-slavery and all of those sort of issues. So stuff gets done faster, but is sometimes a little grayer. And so at that sort of, there's an opaque point there where, should we be maybe consummating our business relationship by going out to the massage parlor? Should we be making things go faster by having, a bit of a bribe around the corner? Should we turn a blind eye to the fact that, yes, I'm doing a research MOU with this other institution, and I'm not entirely sure where the Australian research IP is going to end up. And I'm not entirely sure if that might have something to do with being used by the PLA for some sort of, dual use weapons outcome, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's a great MOU and it will benefit my career back in Australia. So it's that sort of lack of transparency, fast sort of getting around things in a quicker way, and not necessarily paying attention to how, or being able to understand how these things may have a dual purpose that I think is quite. So that's the tricks to the trade that some people don't understand or don't care to understand.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed in the Peak as well, especially when you talk on about Chloe's dad and his work and the links to the CCP as well. So I need to ask, we've talked about Charlie and Sebastian, right? So talk about the character Chloe, her dad, her bodyguard. Are they also based on people you've interacted with or relationships that you've had?
Well, if there was a Chloe, I certainly wouldn't be telling you about it.
No. Not like that, just that,
Yeah. So, I mean, there's character types, right?
Yeah.
And yes, I've known types, particularly like Zheng. There's one person in particular that is vaguely was the archetype for that worked for a Chinese state-owned enterprise that I had a bit to do with. But no, they're all tropes. But what I wanted to capture, which is really realistic, was I didn't want to set this book up as basically as saying, the Chinese are the baddies and the Australians or the Americans are the goodies, because I don't think that's true. And went to some lengths to sort of lay out, whilst yes, I'm documenting the MSS and stuff like to compromise Australians. On the other side, I wanted to sort of lay out about the century of humiliation and talk about the different instances where the Chinese feel they've been betrayed by the Americans. And again, that theme of loyalty. Yeah. And so when that comes into Zheng, and who's the father of Chloe and Chloe herself, you've got Sebastian saying, "Oh, your father's terrible, and he wants to send you to Africa." But Chloe's view is, actually, my father is an engineer who's worked to develop China and to raise people out of poverty and to make us the power that we are today. And now he's looking, and his company is doing that across Africa as well. I want to be a part of that. So Chloe, rather than just being a femme fatale, she's an engineer in her own right. She has these aspirations to go and help in Africa, as China was helped as well. And yet, there's something inside her that is also crying out for a degree of freedom, and the freedom that she finds in her music and that she finds in Sebastian as well. And I think that's quite a. That's the sort of conversation that goes on in places like Hong Kong and in Taiwan. Yes, this pull between, there's a lot to respect about the heritage and about the success of China, but there is a feeling of weight, and what does that mean for our freedoms and for our future? And I was trying to capture that in an empathetic rather than simplistic way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And you've just touched on another point, the music. So there's a playlist that's mentioned quite often in different parts of the book, and it's actually on Spotify, and it's something that I listen to now because you've got some good jams in there, especially with Pearl Jam and Smashing Pumpkins. it's good.
Yeah, well, I'm an old grunge dog from the 90s. I'm older than you, but I loved the Smashing Pumpkins and Dinosaur Jr. and Pearl Jam, and I'm very glad that you're listening to that Spotify list. I think I had about 30 total subscribers to it, so if I knock it up by one more, I'm very happy. So thanks for listening.
No, it's a good playlist. It's well put together. But what can you tell us about that playlist in the book, though, and how it's related to the story and all that kind of thing?
Well, it's sort of the same thing, like I said, I wanted to make the book more than just a political treatise by having these great three-dimensional characters that feel a bit more alive than that. And I made those characters based on my own experience and the experience of my friends. And part of the additional sort of realism of that is I use the music that I listened to coming up, like all of that 90s stuff. I'll listen to it today and I'm immediately cast back into my youth, and I feel all that sort of love and longing that you do when you listen to those songs that you grew up with. But in it, it's a dual use as well, because one of these characters, Charlie, he's a spin doctor. He talks about, he does the knife work in the dark. He's a master of the dark political arts, strategic communicator, all of that. And yet he can't tell Chloe how he really feels about her. And that's actually the reason that everything happens in the book. If he had been able to tell her how he felt about her, then everything bad that happens probably wouldn't be bad. So at that precise moment, when he should have been able to communicate, he couldn't communicate, couldn't tell her how he felt. And so instead, I don't know if you've ever done this with a playlist or a tape, but you can't tell the person you love that you love them. You're too shy. And so you put together a mixtape and you put all the songs on it that you think, well, if she reads the titles or she listens to the chorus, and the big chorus is something like Live singing I Alone Love You or whatever it is, then she's going to hear the secret message and she's going to know that I've got these feelings for her. And And so Charlie does that, and it's he fails and she doesn't understand it, or maybe she doesn't care. But the interesting thing for me was that that's a tape with a whole bunch of secret messages in their youth about love. And then obviously later in the book, the tape comes back and there's some other secret messages associated with it, which become quite important to the story. So it was nice that we could do both the music, and then that also feeds into the broader themes of the book. And it gave me a great excuse to sort of go back and listen to Siamese Dream by the Smashing Pumpkins about 6,000 times. So that was good too.
Absolutely. I can't say I've ever given someone a mixtape to tell them how I feel, but I do remember, when I was a teenager, you listen to music and you're not really sure how to express how you feel, but you listen to the lyrics and it's kind of like, well, that's actually how I'm thinking and that's actually how I'm feeling. So I understand that point.
Like there's Charlie is a loner, and he's, in their childhood, he has a bit of a falling out with his best buddy, Sebastian, who's looked after him at school. And so, he finds himself wandering around the school, spending time, and he's by himself. And to your point, the thing that keeps him company is listening to this music. And so it becomes a real connection. And when he meets Chloe and she likes the music as well, that's like this immediate bond between the two of them, who have been, and Chloe in her own way has been kicking around, thinking, am I Chinese? Do I want to be more Western? She's been alone, and it's the music that draws them together that way.
Yeah, nice. Hey, so now, if you don't mind, I might ask a few questions just about the Indo-Pacific and just based on your experience and your opinion on a few things, if you don't mind. What are Australians and New Zealanders getting right or wrong about China? There's a lot of narratives out there at the moment, especially around China being a threat. Some saying it's not a threat, all that kind of thing. What do you think we're getting right or wrong about China?
I think that there's, and I'll be more informed about Australia, of course, but I think we're so, we're brothers in arms in so many ways between Australia and New Zealand. So it'll be similar. I think that particularly in Australia, the Albanese government has done a very good job in how they would describe as stabilizing the relationship between Australia and China. Australia became somewhat shrill back a number of years ago before a change of government here, and was quite overt about talking of going to war with China and being quite outspoken. Now, at the same time, during that period, China put $20 billion worth of trade barriers against Australian goods, really significantly impacting a lot of industries and sectors in Australia. But interestingly, it didn't impact Australia enough for Australia to sort of bow down to demands from China for things like, well, we want to be able to have open slather to invest in your critical infrastructure. We want our state-owned enterprises to invest wherever they want. And a number of other issues. China, for example, was really annoyed when Australia brought in foreign interference laws that tried to sort of make sure that no foreign state, not just China, but from anywhere, could have an impact on civil institutions in Australia, or that ultimately has an impact on social cohesion within Australia. So there was a bit of tension. This is sort of the 2016 to 2022 period. And I think Australia did a good job in one hand of standing up for itself and saying, we have our laws, we protect and we make our own decisions. It's not all about just taking the money. We're going to look after our critical infrastructure. It's going to be independent. We're going to have foreign interference laws. But then we overreached with some of that, overblown rhetoric, like we're going to war with China. And I think that the current government has talked about stabilization, has not been overly forward-leaning because, of course, China is our major trading partner. Yeah. So a lot of Australia's wealth comes from our relationship with China. We don't want to go to war with China. Of course we don't. We want to have good win-win friendships and relationships with China. And there's a lot of that goes on in a really positive way. And so I think seeing Albanese up there engaging positively is a good thing. On the flip side, there is a lot of understanding that China would like to carve Australia out of Five Eyes and bring it closer to its view of the world. That China, along with Russia and others, has a view that some of the norms, international norms that have benefited Australia and New Zealand over the years would be better to be dismantled and put back into a new way that benefited China and other countries in a greater way. And that goes to things like, law of the sea, for example, when we're talking about South China Sea and elsewhere. And that creates a problem for Australia. That means that Australia becomes, uncertain and concerned with its own resilience, its own economic security. We have had acknowledged cyber intrusions in Australia in a significant way. We see China's presence in the Solomon Islands and around the Pacific Islands more broadly as within, an area that is greater proximity than ever before. We see Chinese flotilla of warships floating around Australia, and that is obviously going to send some shivers up the spines of Australians, even if we don't talk about these issues enough in Australia, as I said before. And as a result, Australia then needs to look towards the US and our traditional alliance partners and see what we need to reinvest into that relationship to try and sort of buffer and balance the two, looking towards the future. And so, Australia buying into AUKUS and being very close to the UK and the US around nuclear submarines and building its own deterrent and strengthening its own, naval industrial complex and beyond, I think is all positive things, because it's a step for our own. But we need to confront the world in which we live as opposed to the world in which we would like to live. And we are in this tricky situation where China is our best trading partner, the US is our alliance partner. Somehow we need to navigate the course between the two, which I know is a very similar experience for New Zealand. It's not easy, and it's only going to get harder, and both sides will want to push us to make a decision. Who do we prefer? And that's as much from China as it is from the US as far as Australia is concerned. And so, I admire our current government that they've been thus far able to navigate that course reasonably well.
Yeah, I call that the tightrope, and it's something that we experience here in New Zealand as well. We've got China, the biggest trading partner of the country, but at the same time, we've got this narrative around an escalating threat and being prepared for, whenever 2027 kind of thing, which is a lot of people are saying. So it's that tightrope, and people seem to forget, well, if flash meets bang and we have to pick a side and we choose not to go with China, well, then our economy is going to be crushed and we have to accept that sort of thing. Yeah,
that's right. And, even some of the rhetoric that comes out of the US today is sort of leaning towards you do need to pick a side. Australia is going to lean into critical minerals, and we've just done a great deal with the Trump White House around that. But what does that mean for our iron ore trade with China? And so that's one hell of a big tightrope, because that is the riches of this country. I think the other key place, though, is there's a lot of grey zone stuff around this too. There's the overt and then there's the grey zone. And, I was at an event at the Lowy Institute last night where Mike Burgess, who's the director of ASIO, the equivalent of MI5 or FBI here, focused on national security. He was speaking and he was talking about the threat environment that we're confronting in Australia. And in his language, he says that espionage activity is currently at unprecedented levels that haven't been seen or actually eclipse what we saw during the Cold War. And he talked about sort of being three buckets of risk or security concern here. One is about the aggrieved. And, that's parties that feel the impact of the cost of living crisis, they're unemployed, they're angry about immigration, and therefore they can become exploited within society. Then there's the opportunistic, and that's your neo-Nazis or your others who would like to use the aggrieved to exploit and to rattle social cohesion. And then there's another bucket called the cunning, who want to use the other two groups to really build out a lot of trouble, a lot of impact on social cohesion, to rock democracy and to rock civil institutions. We've more recently had some issues with Iranian-affiliated people who have tried to stoke issues around Palestine, Israel by arson attacks in Australia, and they were booted out of the country. But there are other grey zone actors who want to use these issues of social discord to try and, again, make the country question its democracy, question its civil institutions, question the traditional alliances that we have. And there is evidence that China, has lent a hand to aspects of that in a consistent way over a period of time. So there's the what's in the front, and then there's what's in the grey zone. And I think the key is that we need to acknowledge it, we need to call it out, and we need to be dispassionate about it. That's why I really respect the sort of analysis that you train people in, because you need to be dispassionate. You just need to understand the world as it is, and then to navigate the tightrope that you're talking about. You can't, as the previous government did, start banging, rattling sabers and saying we're going to war. Well, we're not going to war. We need to navigate that and build our strengths on both sides.
Yeah, and the grey zone is super important, and that's something that comes out really well in your book as well, even though it's not explicitly stated. It's that all the activities that take place, it's like grey zone 101, especially around the business and trade and all that kind of good stuff. Yeah. So that was really cool to see in the book as well. And you're someone that's obviously worked behind the curtain of politics and trade and diplomacy and things like that. Is there anything that surprised you in that world about how things really work compared to what a member of the public might think?
I've copped a bit of a kicking from some political advisors who said that I was too nasty about political advisors in the book. My depiction of them was too nasty. And there's a line in the book that says something like, we always hope that somewhere grown-ups are in charge, and that they are helping us navigate, as we've said, because they're informed and they're doing the right thing, and their national interest is the key objective for them. And that's true. There are many, many wonderful people. I come from the bureaucracy, and I know that within the bureaucracy there are, the most committed people, well-studied, deliberate, getting up every day to look after our countries, and often, always paid less than those in the private sector. So, don't talk to me about deep state bureaucrats because I want to put them on a pedestal. I think they're fantastic.
Yeah.
On the contrary, I've seen people in ministerial offices give advice to ministers, and then ministers acting in a way that is purely political, that is purely about maybe playing to the local constituency and a local electorate that might have many people that from a certain country, and do things and say things and infer things either in public or in private that are entirely contrary to the key talking points of the government on these matters of foreign affairs. And I'm struck by it at every time, because it's that, but again, it's that interplay between self-interest and national interest. And so I'm shocked every time I see that, either behind closed doors or even recently. And I walk a fine line here because I don't want to get sued. But we had a former Australia Premier, Premier of the state of Victoria, showed up at the most recent anniversary celebrations in China, standing on the same red carpeted podium as leaders of North Korea, Vladimir Putin, and obviously Xi Jinping. And you think, why are you there? Why did you not get the memo about, what that means and what that reflects on, Australia, our relationship with the world, and you personally? So I'm always struck by how self-interest can be so in contrast by those that we expect to lead, how much it can be. But that's where this book ends, right? Like a book ends by just going, humans are flawed, and that's the thing that you can rely on. They will always be flawed. And I think sometimes we miss that some of the great plays and changes in history, they don't come down to grand strategy. They come down to the people. George W. Bush wanted to go to war in Iraq and was open to that because I felt bad about his father failing to do it. Donald Trump having issues with various people that he wants to have investigated because he feels maligned by what occurred to him in the past. Or in this case, maybe someone's business interests allow them to stand on a stage and send potentially the wrong message. So I'm really interested in that, and I've seen a lot of that, self-interest in the face of national interest. I think that you take one step down that street, it's like at the moment in my book where the character puts a USB into his computer system, and he knows very well that this is bad and this is the beginning. And you do that first step, that first action of the USB, and beginning to spy, beginning to be compromised, beginning to embrace that. Well, the first step, there's no going back. And so now there's only 100 and 200 and infinite steps forward down that path of being compromised. And to me, it's that pressure at that moment that is really, really interesting.
Yeah. Your book nails all of that, but especially the political intrigue as well. Someone to give insight into the political workings and self-interest versus national interest. I really enjoyed that part of the book. And you touch on the USB. A lot of, like we used to say, the biggest threat is always the insider threat. And our systems are very, very fragile. It's really all it takes in a lot of cases. It's not the Chinese spy, it's not the Russian spy outside the gates. It's usually always an insider who's been coerced or has motivations to do that kind of thing. And you capture that really well in the book.
Yeah, the trusted insider. I think that's and isn't that interesting? I think that's more interesting in their psychology than the car chase and the exploding pen, as I say. And
absolutely,
it's particularly in the context of AUKUS and on the boss of ASIO here. He often talks about the number of people on LinkedIn who will put that they've got a security clearance on their LinkedIn profile. And I think they did like a study, and there's like 1,000 people in Australia that are out there saying, I work for government and I've got a very significant security clearance. And people are doing that because they want a new job and they're looking for some positioning on LinkedIn. But of course, then you're making yourself such a target for foreign actors. And so it's even in the smallest thing, which seems like the smallest thing, how do I write about myself on LinkedIn? It's sort of the same. So I find all that really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Sam, we're getting up to that time. It's gone super fast. It's been a great discussion. So I need to ask, are we going to see more from Charlie in the future?
Well, there's enough in there for there to be more from Charlie.
Yeah.
So I set it up that there's certainly more that we can hear. I'd also like to hear more from McCubbin, who is my rather overblown version of the ASIO head. I thought he was a cracker, but not yet. I've got another 2-book deal with HarperCollins in Australia and the UK, which does sort of global English in English language, but it's going to be a little bit different. Same sort of concept for the next one. It'll be geopolitical background with characters right up front. There'll still be China, but I'm going to spend a little bit of time. It kicks off in London, this one, a little bit of Eastern Europe, and then back to Hong Kong and China. So I'll do a bit of something else for a while, let Charlie have go and smoke and listen to the Smashing Pumpkins for a while, and then I'll come back to him a bit later.
Can I ask, is it all going to be captured in the same kind of universe sort of thing?
Yes. I'm trying to do that. We'll see if the publisher likes it, but yes, I want things to be, there might be some cameos.
Nice. Nice. Yeah, because I finished the Peak, and I was like, surely there's a sequel coming. There has to be.
Thank you. Well, I'll put you in touch with my publisher and the filmmakers as well. Yeah.
Right. Oh, awesome. Good to know. Yeah. Hey, just to wrap it up, where can people follow your work, get your book, all that kind of thing? Any personal plugs you want to do?
Oh, you're very kind. Look, the book is available everywhere. It's on Amazon. It's on anywhere you buy an ebook. There's audiobooks on Spotify, on Apple. So it's out there at your favorite local bookstore. Unfortunately, I don't have a deal in the US, but you can get it through HarperCollins in the UK or as I say, anywhere online, and import it in. And if you want to find out more about me, I'm on Instagram, which is how we connected. I'm a big follower of your great work on Instagram. As I said before, I learn a lot from all of that work. I love the open source stuff and your analysis. I can imagine why, Cole, you've got such a good business actually training people in real life and doing that as your core, because it's so insightful. And so I follow you there, and people can follow me there. I think it's Sam Guthrie, author. Look me up and I'll tell you stuff about me. So please reach out.
Awesome, Sam. And I'll put all the links in the description below so anyone can find you. And I highly recommend anyone listening, check out Sam's book, The Peak. I can't recommend it enough, especially if you've got an interest in geopolitics, intelligence, and all that kind of stuff. It covers it all quite comprehensively, and it's an engaging story. And I loved it.
Thank you, man. Thank you.